Welcome back to another season review of The Shield, where today we're taking a look at Season 3. Be sure to check out my reviews of Season 1 and 2 and consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. In Season 3, Vic and the strike team deal with the fallout of the money train heist, with the Armenian mob having launched a vicious and bloody manhunt to find out who was responsible. The actions of Vic and his team at the end of Season 2 has caused a lot of damage. There's a lot of dismembered feet in this season. And one after another, roadblocks get in the way of them putting away and investing the fruits of their money train heist, most notably about halfway through the season if I remember correctly, finding out that a significant portion of the money is marked by the cops, meaning they won't actually be able to spend it. The quartet start to feel the walls closing in on them throughout Season 3, with one of the members, Lem, becoming increasingly guilty and their shenanigans having perked the ears of the likes of Aceveda, Claudette and even Dutch. I gotta admit, I've taken quite a liking to Dutch. I mentioned in my review of Season 1 that it's quite hard what to make of what he's supposed to be, a hotshot detective or a department goof, but I like him as a character now. He's got an oddball quality to him. Some other things to note in a season atypically jam-packed with various storylines and characters is that for political correctness reasons, Acaveda tells Vic a person of colour needs to join their strike team, which ends up being Tavon, a solid cop but one who Vic remains suspicious of and who clashes with Shane. Shane's getting married to a woman I find delightfully irritating in a Lady Macbeth kind of way. Sure, she's got Shane and her best interests at heart, but she causes major friction between the two best friends by being in Shane's ear constantly about wanting to distance themselves from Vic. Plus, in one of the subplots, it's revealed that some of the money is missing, and after a fair bit of finger-pointing, arguments, and shady side eye glances, it turns out that she actually stole the money and gave it to her mother, sparking another subplot of trying to get the mother-in-law to shut her trap. One thing I wanted to talk about, and this isn't really a complaint, more of an observation, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, are the recaps the show does before each episode kicks off. Sometimes I wonder about the effect this has on the viewer when watching the episode, because the recaps aren't just of what happened the last episode, as many shows do. They're relevant as to what's happening in the current episode, so we could get clips of stuff that's happened as far back as the first season, if it's about to be brought up in this episode. So if we start getting a few clips of, say, Julian and that guy who was extorting him, what that means is I'm prepared to get a lot of Julian in this episode, maybe even a return of that other dude, even if Julian hasn't been prominent in the last few episodes. I guess what I'm saying is, sometimes it can have an effect on the element of surprise, when older storylines are suddenly part of the mix again, because we're given a major signpost through the recaps, a massive indicator of upcoming story beats. Then again, these recaps are very helpful in jogging your memory, and without them I might be left scratching my head trying to remember who's who. Ultimately, it's nitpicking, and a result of growing up in a spoiler-obsessed generation. Another small thing I wanted to note is that I've only just realised that each episode of the show has its own title, and not just episode 1, 2, 3, 4. The TV channel that I've been watching the show on doesn't show the episode titles. It's not a big deal, but I wish I had known the episode titles going in so I knew how it would relate to the episode's content. So in terms of what I think of the season, I would say I perhaps initially had a bit of bad taste in my mouth, which evaporated over time as the season got better and better until it culminated in a satisfying conclusion. I'm not sure where I'd rank it. That's something I'd be better able to decipher once I finish the show. But I'm happy to say it isn't the sudden drop in quality from season 1 and 2 that I had initially feared, because I had heard that season 3 wasn't as good as season 1 and 2. I think that bad taste came from elements, radical changes that were promised, that had been retconned. Retconned is too strong a word, maybe delayed or stretched out, but the show did these things organically enough so that I thought to myself, okay, this does make sense, I guess. For example, previously on The Shield, as mentioned in my Season 2 review, Danielle was dismissed, and I found it very impactful, especially since she was thrown under the bus by Vic. But she's back this season, back on the streets. Aceveda was supposed to move on to City Council, and Claudette, with her antagonism towards Vic, was going to be in charge of the barn. Turns out, Aceveda's staying on for a while, and Claudette's bitterness and resentment was matched by my cynical feeling that perhaps the showrunners realised that they were onto a winner with this show, so decided to slow down major changes in order that more seasons can be pumped out. I don't know if that's true, but whilst it is a legitimate observation, it flattened out as the show did the quote-unquote retcon quite seamlessly and used it to enhance the show. Things are the same, but characters are different. Like, for example, yes, Aceveda is still around and Claudette isn't in charge as promised, but the dynamics are different now. Something's aloof about Aceveda. He wants to do things by the book, by the numbers. There's a distance about him, like he doesn't really care. He's already got one foot out the front door and just wants no drama or scandal, like he's morphing into a politician. Claudette, previously not wanting the job, is now furious she didn't get it, and Aceveda placates her by putting her in charge of both the strike team and a separate decoy squad, with mixed results for both the teams and her career. There was an interesting storyline that showcased Aceveda's newfound political savviness. There's a Latino guy with connections who gets caught breaking the law, and Aceveda's political friend tells him to find a way to let the guy go, and he reluctantly looks like he's going to. Claudette is visibly furious, and later the media gets a wind of this whole thing, meaning Aceveda is forced to have the guy processed properly, with the politician guy obviously thinking Claudette leaked this to the media. It turns out, though, that Aceveda was the one who leaked it to the media, and so what we end with is a man who committed a crime going down as he rightly should do. Aceveda still being in his politician friends' good books because they'll see him as having his hands tied on this one, and Aceveda, when he eventually leaves the place to someone who he can trust and whose ear he can have from City Hall. Good politics all round, but unfortunately, it's actually a rather rare example of Aceveda and Claudette being on the same page this season. Danielle is back, but they brought her back through an appeal. Like, duh, why hadn't I considered that? It's a perfectly legitimate way to bring a canned officer back into the mix. But again, things are different. She's kind of been left behind by her old partner Julian, who's beginning to embed himself with the rank and file, becoming a typical abusive street goon, the Western District way, as characters from The Wire might say, perhaps overcompensating to make up for the fact that the department know he is or was a homosexual, and it's a change Danielle seems to notice. And it's not like we just get a bit of a reset and start going again. The characters evolve and their storylines develop in ways you wouldn't expect going in. I mean, Claudette's gone from potentially running the shop to being blacklisted by the end of the season, in light of her opening up older case files, threatening to undo police work and have people released from prison after finding out a lawyer may have been on drugs during trials. Going back to what I said about initially not feeling this season, thinking about it, I think it also might have had to do with a formulaic feel that creeps up every now and again. Like, there'll be a routine of Claudette getting a phone call, which means everything has to be dropped. Vic is walking past and takes an interest. Suddenly he's thundering down the road, the only man who can get the job done. There's a repetition that can become noticeable, and I think the solution here is just to take a break from the show for a few days. After all, it was not made in an era of binge watching and feels a lot more fresh if you leave it for a while and then come back to it. And I think that feeling went away anyway around the halfway mark when the season began to come into its own. Something happens to Aceveda in season 3, and it was not pleasant. In fact, it was one of the most horrifying sequences in the show, I feel. Now, you obviously know what I'm talking about if you've seen the show, and if for some reason you're watching this review without having seen the show, well, Aceveda is on the job in some kind of banged up crack den or something, and for whatever reason he ends up alone. 2 goons get the drop on him, beating him and then tying his hands behind his back. On his knees, Aceveda is told to perform an action on one of the goons' persons or he'll be shot, and the poor guy is begging and pleading. But after cutting back from a separate scene, the show just shows him going at it. Ugh, it was horrible, man. I did not need to see that. And whatever you think of Aceveda, he did not deserve that. I was having flashbacks to watching Oz with half my face covered in horror. They show the rhythm and thrusting and everything. Aceveda's face buried in the guy's crotch, choking and spluttering. the perp whooping and hollering and filming it too. It was deeply, deeply uncomfortable and very effective. It's uncommon to see violations like this in TV anyway, let alone it being a man and a police captain. But it was so drawn out, and the fact that the victim was someone you've been following for 2 seasons made it really impactful. And it's not like it was in the season finale or anything, it catches you off guard somewhere in the middle of the season. I've never seen anything like this in a show before. I was waiting for that moment when a cop would burst in through the door before it happens, while it's happening even, but that moment never comes. In fact, the show cruelly has a cop show up to the house as Aceveda's trying with all his might to cry out, but to no avail, and the cop leaves. This scene really makes you feel the sense of powerlessness and humiliation of this act. Even the goon's buddy thought he was going too far. Plus, as I am a man, it makes you think, well, what would you do in this situation? Would you put your pride before the chance to live and raise your family? Would you get it over and done with? Would you rather die with dignity? Who knows what one would do in such a situation? It was deeply emasculating even to witness it, let alone seeing how it affects Aceveda, his relationship with his wife, and how it starts to send him on a downward spiral. And funnily enough, in a way this was Vic's doing, because if you remember, earlier in the episode, Vic shoves a massive bong down this very guy's throat. There is aggressive, violent, phallic imagery at play here, and the perp would have of course been itching to repay this favour to any cop that was at his mercy. The whole thing was raw, from the act itself, from Aceveda's deep shame and avoidance of his wife to his dry heaving in the toilet later, and the way it affects Aceveda, the way others who know react, is one of the most interesting parts of the season. But I gotta say, when Aceveda eventually tells his wife, I have to admit I did laugh at her reaction. She was like, "They made you suck? Both of them?" It wasn't exactly the most sympathetic of reactions, was it? For sure there is a processing period, it's shocking news, but here he is, spilling the beans on what has been infecting him these past weeks. He tells her he did it for her, for their kid, to stay alive so he can be with them. And she's just like, and like runs out of the room. Curious reaction, and it makes you wonder if telling the truth in this situation is actually the right thing to do or not. There's some really hard, uncomfortable scenes and plots in this season. Par the course for the Shield, I guess, but there's a fair few standouts. And it isn't just visceral violence, but very uncomfortable scenes like Aceveda's confession, as mentioned. When Vic choked the guy with the bong, it looked so realistic. The episode where the cop is accused of killing his family was really downbeat and ends with him taking himself out. That part where the Korean gangster on the bike rides out of the apartment spraying bullets everywhere, hitting 2 kids and killing one. Tavon and Shane get into a brutal brawl at the latter's home. Again, it feels so realistic with the way everything gets trashed and the way they beat on each other. And when Vic and the crew later gaslight the recovering memory loss ridden Tavon, telling him he was at fault, and he struck Shane's pregnant wife when he specifically stopped himself from doing so, it was a major low point for the crew. Curtis Lem certainly seems to think so, who finds himself more and more alienated with the direction the strike team is taking, especially the tension over the money train cash. He eventually makes the startling decision to burn all of the cash to the horror of the other 3 strike team members. And the shot of them rolling around the floor trying to stop Lem, the end of season 4, was a great shot, an unusually cinematic one from this show, where it went from the guys exhausted by their fight to the money to the fire, as if to say, this is what happened, this is what for, and this is to what end. But it's also worth mentioning that the money train findings being burned acts like that soft reset that I mentioned earlier in the video, that it does feel like the showrunners realised there was potential for a long-running show here, and knew they'd made the strike team peak too early by giving them enough money to ride out into the sunset, so wrote a storyline that would reset this. But again though, it felt organic enough, and it has major ramifications for the friendship of these 4 men. It's a believable way to end the storyline, and frankly I'm kinda happy the money train storyline has been put to bed. Honestly, I find it a bit confusing and hard to follow, what with the constantly changing dynamics around the money train and Vic's relationship with the street characters. There would always be some kind of development every 2 episodes or so that meant the strike team was inches away from being discovered, meaning Vic would have to rush off to meet a drug dealer or something, and I could never quite always work out what the issue was. One final thing worth talking about is Dutch. Like, what the heck, man? What are you doing, lad? So he has a conversation with the murderer, who starts talking about something that happens at the time of death when you're taking someone out. Dutch can't quite understand it, and the guy also tells him that his dad told him to get rid of a dog when he was a kid, and he went from stroking it to choking it. And later, there's a cat that is outside Dutch's home, which he picks up and starts stroking, and then he chokes it out. Blimey. As of yet, it's not really been brought up again, aside from Dutch choosing not to take home one of the many kittens which some cop confiscated and brought to the barn. Dutch obviously makes a lot of effort to get into the minds of serial killers and whatnot, and perhaps this was an instance of gazing too long into the abyss, and the abyss now staring back at him. It reminds me of this Sidney Lumet film, The Offence, where Sean Connery plays a cop who goes after a pedo, and because of what he's had to deal with trying to get into the minds of criminals, he ends up getting pedo tendencies himself. It'll be interesting to see if the show does something with that. So I think I'll leave it there. A really interesting season with a lot of talking points, and one that appears to have actually shaken things up by the end, so we'll see where things go from here. What do you make of The Shield Season 3? Let me know in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.